time for war. We the generation that's gon' get on one accord. Serpents lurking, watchers watching, y'all should rather stay on point. We under the covenant, we ain't got no other choice. Gird your loins up, armor up, cause it's time for war.
But it gets worse. Muhammad tells his followers what Satan looks like in Ibn Asaq, page 243. The apostle said, "Whoever wants to see Satan, let him look at Nabtal ibn al-Harith. He was a sturdy black man with long flowing hair, inflamed eyes, and dark ruddy cheeks." Sahih al-Bukhari 6161. Narrated Anas bin Malik, Allah's messenger was on a journey, and he had a black slave called Anjasha, and he was driving the camels very fast, and there were women riding on those camels. Allah's messenger said, "Waihaka, O Anjasha, drive slowly the camels with the glass vessels," i.e. the women. Here's one about a black slave who was shot to death while unloading Muhammad's luggage. Sunan an-Nasai 3858. It was narrated that Abu Huraira said, "We were with the Messenger of Allah in the year of Khaybar, and we did not get any spoils of war except for wealth, goods, and clothes. Then a man from Banu ad-Dubayb, who was called Rifa bin Zayd, gave the Messenger of Allah a black slave who was called Middam. The Messenger of Allah set out for Wadi al-Qura. When we were in Wadi al-Qura, while Middam was unloading the luggage of the Messenger of Allah, an arrow came and killed him. The people said, 'Congratulations, you will go to paradise.' But the Messenger of Allah said, 'No, by the one in whose hand is my soul, the cloak that he took from the spoils of war on the day of Khaybar is burning him with fire.'" Just to clarify, Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old girl, robbed caravans, and beheaded hundreds of Jews, but he's good. His black slave, by contrast, grabbed a cloak before the spoils were divided, so he's headed to hell. Welcome to Islam.
Although the Islamic countries of the Middle East and North Africa imported more slaves from sub-Saharan Africa than did the European offshoot nations of the Western Hemisphere, there are in these Muslim countries today no such large, discrete, and self-conscious groups of black African descent as the 60 million Negroes currently living in the Western Hemisphere. Among the reasons for this anomaly were the higher mortality rates of slaves in transit to North Africa and the Middle East, their greater vulnerability to the diseases of that region, and a very low rate of reproduction. Because the slaves were brought from long distances, often from isolated villages, they might lack biological resistance to the diseases encountered along the overland slave trade routes or at their final destinations. Although manumission was widespread in Islamic lands, the beneficiaries of this were often military slaves and others in higher occupations, where the slaves were most apt to be white rather than black. In general, black slaves were used in more menial and laborious tasks, and it was these slaves who were most likely to live and die as slaves, with their children being born into slavery. They had few children, however, for both marriage and casual sex among slaves was suppressed. Moreover, the death rate among those few children was so high that they rarely lived to adulthood. The widespread use of eunuchs in the harems of the Islamic countries further reduced the ability of the African slave population to reproduce itself. In the 10th century, the court of the Caliph of Baghdad reportedly included 7,000 black eunuchs and 4,000 white eunuchs. With the passing centuries, as European nations grew militarily stronger and became better able to resist the Islamic nations, European slaves became scarcer in the Islamic lands to which they had once been sent in great numbers. Their importation was drastically reduced in the early decades of the 19th century, when Tsarist Russia conquered the Caucasus, from which European slaves were being shipped to the Ottoman Empire. However, as late as the 1850s, orders against the traffic in white slaves from Russian-controlled Georgia and Circassia were being issued by the Ottoman government. By the end of the 19th century, white slaves had virtually disappeared, except in Arabia, while black slavery was not abolished in most Islamic countries until the period between the two world wars of the 20th century, and still existed in Mauritania and the Sudan at the end of the 20th century. The horrors of the Atlantic voyage in packed and suffocating slave ships, together with exposure to new diseases from Europeans and other African tribes, as well as the general dangers of the Atlantic crossing in that era, took a toll in lives amounting to about 10% of all slaves shipped to the Western Hemisphere in British vessels in the 18th century, the British being the leading slave traders of that era. However, the death toll among slaves imported by the Islamic countries, many of these slaves being forced to walk across the vast burning sands of the Sahara, was twice as high, Thousands of human skeletons were strewn along one Saharan slave route alone, mostly the skeletons of young women and girls. These skeletons tended to cluster in the vicinity of wells, suggesting the last desperate efforts to reach water. Slaves who could not keep up with the caravans, often because their feet had swollen from walking across the hot sands, were abandoned in the desert to die a lingering death from heat, thirst, and hunger. In 1849, a letter from an Ottoman official referred to 1,600 black slaves dying of thirst on their way to Libya. On another route, it was said that someone unfamiliar with the desert might almost be able to find his way just by following the trail of skeletons of people and camels. Widespread loss of life began with the initial slave raids. As late as 1886, an Austrian who was an apologist for slavery nevertheless reported, "Negro villages are burned, all the men killed, and their women and children are taken on months-long, terrible marches." The march from slave-gathering areas, like the region around Lake Chad, across the Sahara Desert to the Mediterranean Sea took about 3 months, and often only the strongest survived. Other slave routes to Islamic countries were over water, but this meant risking interception by the British Navy, and that in turn often meant that slaves were thrown overboard to drown rather than being allowed to remain on board to be discovered as incriminating evidence. The trans-Saharan caravan route was the most deadly, however. It has been estimated that, for every slave to reach Cairo alive, 10 died on the way. Nor was Cairo exceptional. Missionary explorer David Livingstone, among others, estimated that several slaves were captured for every one that reached the Mediterranean alive. Women were particularly vulnerable, and were more in demand than men. They brought higher prices in the Islamic countries, where they were widely used as domestic servants or as concubines. Ethiopian women sold for higher prices than Negro women, and white women from the Caucasus brought the highest prices of all. A special danger to men and boys was castration, to produce the eunuchs widely used in Islamic countries for work in the harems. Because the operation was forbidden under Islamic law, it was usually performed early, and often crudely, before reaching areas under the effective control of the Ottoman Empire. An estimated 90% of the men or boys died from the operation, though some groups of slave traders were sufficiently skilled to have much lower mortality rates. Eunuchs brought far higher prices than other slaves. Dead and dying slaves were a common sight in the wake of a slave caravan. David Livingstone said that the common incidents of the slave trade that he had seen were so nauseous that I always strive to drive them from memory. For example, one woman, who was unable to carry both her load and young child, had the child taken from her and saw its brains dashed out on a stone.
Anybody would treat a human being like that. I don't know why many Saudi Arabians are treating Africans like this and getting away with it. As you know, this is not peculiar to Kenyans. Ethiopians are treated the same way. I've talked about this in the past. In fact, there are several pictures of Ethiopians killed in Saudi Arabia, men and women. But how come this is still happening after they deported thousands of immigrants from Saudi Arabia? How come they are still treating people like this? I found out that Saudi Arabia's sponsorship system known as kafala ties employment visas to employers, indirectly turning voluntary servitude to slavery. They do this to Asians as well. They would arrange a resident permit by recruiting agencies that match the worker to the household, and then they would charge both parties a recruitment fee. So now the workers will become indebted to the agencies. A typical workday for domestic workers in Saudi Arabia is between 15 to 18 hours in a day. Imagine somebody working straight for 18 hours in a day out of 24 hours, and they pay them about $5 to $7 per day. And guess what? Some of these employers would refuse to pay the employees for a long time. In fact, sometimes for years they may not pay their employees. They would say, we're giving you food, we're giving you a place to sleep, even if it's outside. They would say, what do you need the money for? So many employers have actually killed their employees if they keep asking for their money. There are no off days, no rest hours, there is no vacation, no nothing. As you know, slavery was officially abolished in Saudi Arabia in 1960. At that time though, there were about 300,000 slaves still in Saudi Arabia. Even though it was abolished on paper, hey, the practice continued unofficially. First of all, when will our people in Africa learn that the grass is not necessarily greener on the other side and that not all the glitter is gold? I mean, we've been hearing stories like this for a long time, yet there are people who are still bent on taking their chances. As bad as it was for Joyce, she's actually very lucky. Very lucky, because several women were not able to escape for years. I've read stories of women who escaped after 2 years, after 4 years, and some were actually killed by their owners. Some men are treated the same way. In fact, 2 years ago, a Saudi man was advertising a male slave on Facebook, and he stated that they've castrated the man, rendering him impotent. This is the English version of what he said. So this is the thing. If you're not going to Saudi for tourism or for pilgrimage or to take up a professional job, please be careful. Please and please be careful. Again, I wish that African leaders would just develop our countries so that our people would not continue to suffer in the hands of such people in the name of searching for better life. And lastly, if you know someone or someone who knows someone who's desperate to get out of his or her country without knowing anything about where they're going, and please warn them to be familiar with where they're going. At least be able to speak the language of where you're going. Don't go anywhere because you got a contract from anyone. Really, Saudi Arabia, for how long would you treat Africans like this? And you know, I can't help but remember that hashtag that was started by Ethiopians when so many of them were being deported from Saudi Arabia. They had this hashtag called "Someone Tell Saudi Arabia." Someone tell Saudi Arabia that you cannot continue to treat human beings like this. Someone tell Saudi Arabia that just because the color of our skin is different from yours doesn't mean you're better in any way. Someone tell Saudi Arabia that the world is watching. We know what is going on. Someone tell Saudi Arabia that enough is enough. Someone tell Saudi Arabia that this will not go on for long. Someday Africa will take its rightful place among the rising continents. Someone tell Saudi Arabia. Guess what? I'm just keeping it real.
Muslims, like their Western Christian counterparts centuries later, regarded the enslavement of black Africans as a blessing in disguise to the victims. Black slaves, it was believed, were fortunate in that they were spared the barbarities of their own kind, and even more so because they were destined to be introduced to the religion and civilized values of Islam, with the black used as an example of simplicity and piety. Blacks generally are unfavorably depicted in medieval Islamic literature and arts as savages, in adventure literature, demonized in fairy tales, or commonly referred to as lazy, stupid, evil-smelling and lecherous slaves. Writing on the image of blacks in Turkish folklore, P.N. Boratav points out that the Negro is nothing more or less than the symbol of wickedness and barbarism. Similarly, studies on the image of blacks in medieval Iranian writings reveal that in both Arab and Persian Muslim writings, blacks are depicted as stupid, untruthful, vicious, sexually unbridled, ugly and distorted, excessively merry, and easily affected by music and drink. Some Persian romances add to these stereotypes the images of blacks as cannibals, infidels, enemies of God and Islam, who attack and attempt to occupy Muslim lands. Jihad is portrayed as the only response to the infidel Zanj, the Persian equivalent of Negro, whom God himself once destroyed. The killing of a single black is penance for a lifetime of sin. Great Arab Muslim geographers such as Ibn Hawqal of the 10th century simply did not see the need to waste ink and paper recording anything about blacks. He wrote, "I have not described the country of the African blacks and other peoples of the torrid zone, because naturally loving wisdom, ingenuity, religion, justice, and regular government, how could I notice such people as these, or magnify them by inserting an account of their countries?"
in his hand. Destruction gotta come, that's how he get us out this lane. The devil working hard, trying to get us out his plane. His sheep hear his voice, so he can't get us out his hand. We gon' trust the son of man, blow your wings, Father. Your kingdom coming, we just trying to make it in, Father. Rather we